On the morning of December 8, 1941, the grand ballrooms of America's finest hotels fell silent as radios crackled with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's declaration of war. Within hours, a transformation began that would strip luxury liners and coastal steamers of their peacetime elegance and thrust them into the brutal machinery of global conflict. The magnificent vessels that had once carried honeymooners to Caribbean paradises and businessmen across the Atlantic would soon ferry soldiers into the maw of war, their polished decks destined to run red with blood. The concept of requisitioning civilian vessels for military service stretched back centuries, but never had it occurred on such a scale or with such urgency. The attack on Pearl Harbor had devastated America's Pacific Fleet, and the nation found itself woefully unprepared for the logistical nightmare of fighting a Toshan war. The United States Navy needed troop transports, hospital ships, supply vessels, and coastal patrol craft, and it needed them immediately. Vice Admiral Emory Scott Land, chairman of the United States Maritime Commission, faced an impossible task. The regular Navy simply did not possess enough ships to move millions of troops across vast oceanic distances while simultaneously protecting convoys from submarine wolf packs. His solution would become one of the war's most extraordinary improvisations: the systematic conversion of civilian passenger vessels into military transports, creating what naval historians would later call the Patchwork Fleet. The first vessels to receive conversion orders were the great ocean liners. The SS Normandy, pride of the French line, lay berthed at Pier 88 in New York Harbor when war came. At over 1,000 feet long and capable of carrying nearly 2,000 passengers in unparalleled luxury, she represented the pinnacle of maritime elegance. The ship's Art Deco dining room could seat 700 beneath Lalique glass panels and gilded columns. Her grand salon featured furniture by Rollman and Dunand, while her smoking room boasted lacquered panels depicting scenes from mythology. According to declassified documents from the National Archives and Records Administration, the Navy Department issued requisition orders for 43 major passenger vessels in the first 3 months following Pearl Harbor. The transformation process began with brutal efficiency. Workers swarmed aboard the Normandy-named USS Lafayette in January 1942, stripping away decades of accumulated refinement. Carved wooden panels that had taken master craftsmen months to create were pried loose in minutes. Crystal chandeliers crashed to the floor. Plush carpeting was rolled up and discarded. The swimming pool that had delighted first-class passengers was drained and converted into cargo space. Similar scenes unfolded across American ports. The SS Manhattan, SS Washington, and SS America all underwent rapid conversion. The graceful lines that had made these ships floating palaces were obscured beneath coats of battleship gray paint, and portholes were welded shut or painted over to prevent light from escaping during nighttime operations. Machine gun emplacements appeared on decks where shuffleboard courts had stood. The luxury suites where wealthy travelers had spent leisurely transatlantic crossings were gutted and rebuilt as cramped troop quarters, with bunks stacked for high and men packed into spaces designed for a fraction of their number. By February 1942, the transformation extended beyond the great liners to encompass virtually every vessel capable of carrying troops or supplies. The luxury yacht Williamsburg, which had served as a floating retreat for wealthy industrialist Hugh Judson Kilpatrick, found itself pressed into service as a presidential yacht before being converted to military duty. Coastal steamers that had carried vacationers to resort towns along the eastern seaboard received hasty modifications and were deployed as submarine spotters and convoy escorts. The urgency intensified as German U-boats began hunting along the American coast in what Admiral Karl Dönitz called Operation Drumbeat. The waters off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, became known as Torpedo Junction, as merchant ships fell victim to submarines operating with devastating effectiveness in the poorly defended coastal shipping lanes. Between January and August 1942, German submarines sank nearly 400 ships in American waters, many within sight of horrified witnesses standing on beaches. The Navy's desperate need for patrol craft led to the requisitioning of fishing trawlers, private yachts, and even harbor tour boats. The Casco-class cutters, many originally designed as luxury yachts, were stripped of their mahogany fittings and brass fixtures, armed with deck guns and depth charge racks, and sent to hunt submarines. The transformation was often comically inadequate, Some vessels retained their ornate nameplates and polished wooden wheels even as they steamed into combat zones. Captain Ernest McNeill Eller, who served as a naval historian and witnessed these conversions firsthand, later wrote in his memoirs that the Patchwork fleet represented a triumph of American improvisation. Over proper naval planning, born of necessity and executed with characteristic disregard for conventional wisdom, his observations, preserved in the Naval Historical Center's archives, provide invaluable insight into the chaos of those early war months. The conversion of hotel ships' passenger vessels that had served specific routes with hotel-like regularity presented unique challenges. These ships, unlike the great transatlantic liners, were designed for comfort on shorter voyages. The SS Yarmouth, which had run between Boston and Nova Scotia, carried elegant dining facilities and spacious staterooms, but lacked the structural reinforcement needed for military service in contested waters. Engineers worked frantically to strengthen hulls, install defensive armament, and create adequate berthing for the hundreds of troops these vessels would carry. The human cost of these hasty conversions soon became apparent. 1942. As workers continued stripping the Lafayette of her luxurious fittings, a fire broke out aboard the vessel. The exact cause remains disputed. Some blamed a welder's torch igniting Kapok life preservers, while others suggested sabotage, but the result was catastrophic. The fire spread rapidly through the ship's interior, fed by wooden paneling and paint fumes. Despite the efforts of New York City firefighters, the Lafayette developed a severe list as water from their hoses accumulated in her upper works. By the following morning, the once proud liner had capsized at her berth, a total loss. The disaster claimed one life directly and represented the loss of a vessel that could have transported thousands of troops. The Lafayette catastrophe forced a re-evaluation of conversion procedures. Fire suppression systems were given higher priority, and the Navy instituted stricter safety protocols during the modification process. Yet the pressure to produce troop transports continued unabated. By spring 1942, conversion yards from Brooklyn to San Francisco operated around the clock, transforming civilian vessels into military transports at a rate of dozens per month. March 1942 marked a turning point in the conversion program as the largest vessels completed their transformations and prepared for their first military voyages. The Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, the two largest passenger liners ever built, had already begun war service under British command. But American vessels soon joined them in carrying unprecedented numbers of troops across dangerous waters. The USS West Point, formerly the SS America and one of the United States Line's flagship vessels, emerged from conversion capable of carrying 8,175 troops, nearly 5 times her peacetime passenger capacity. The transformation obliterated every trace of her former elegance, where first-class passengers had dined on fine china beneath crystal chandeliers. Soldiers now ate from metal trays while standing in mess lines. The ship's smoking room, designed by Dorothy Draper in her signature modern Baroque style, became a troop berthing area, with canvas bunks suspended from the ceiling in tiers. The engineering required to support such massive troop loads staggered even experienced naval architects. Freshwater production had to be tripled through the installation of additional evaporators. Ventilation systems designed for peacetime passenger loads proved woefully inadequate for the thousands of men packed below decks in tropical heat. Sanitation facilities designed for 1,500 passengers now served over 8,000 users. Engineers jerry-rigged additional toilets, showers, and wash basins wherever space permitted, creating plumbing systems that barely functioned under the strain. Life aboard these converted liners bore no resemblance to their peacetime luxury. Soldiers slept in shifts, with men rotating through bunks on a hot bunking system as one group rose for duty. Another took their place in still warm bedding. The air below decks grew thick and fetid, reeking of unwashed bodies, diesel fumes, and the ever-present threat of seasickness. During rough weather, when portholes had to remain sealed and ventilation systems struggled, conditions became nearly unbearable. According to research published in the Naval Institute Proceedings in 1998, the converted luxury liners transported over 3 million troops during the war years, with the Queen Mary alone carrying over 800,000 service members. The article, authored by naval historian John McStone Graham, documented that these ships traveled at speeds exceeding 28 knots, fast enough to outrun most German submarines without requiring convoy escort, a crucial advantage given the Navy's shortage of destroyers in the war's early years. The speed that made these vessels valuable as independent transports also made them vulnerable targets. German naval intelligence tracked the movements of the major Allied troop ships obsessively, and U-boat commanders received orders to sink them at all costs. Hitler himself reportedly offered the Iron Cross with oak leaves and a reward of 250,000 Reichsmarks plus a lifetime pension to any submarine captain who could sink the Queen Mary or Queen Elizabeth. Neither was ever hit, though several close calls reminded crews that their gray-painted hulls offered no protection against torpedoes. The USS Wakefield, converted from the SS Manhattan, demonstrated the risks these ships faced. On September 3, 1942, while operating 600 miles east of Newfoundland with over 1,500 troops and crew aboard, fire broke out in a storage compartment. The blaze spread rapidly, despite efforts to contain it, and the ship's commander ordered abandoned ship. The destroyer USS Mayo and several other vessels rescued everyone aboard without loss of life, but the Wakefield burned for 3 days before being taken under tow. Repairs took over a year, removing a crucial transport from service during a critical period. While the great liners garnered headlines and transported troops across oceans, a vast fleet of smaller converted vessels performed equally vital but less glamorous duties. By summer 1942, the Navy had requisitioned over 200 coastal passenger steamers, ferries, and excursion boats, transforming them into the workhorses of the war effort. The SS General Slocum, named after a vessel that had burned with horrific loss of life in 1904, served the route between New York and various coastal resorts. Her conversion typified the challenges faced when adapting vessels designed for day trips into military transports. The ship's main deck, intended for passengers to stroll and enjoy ocean views, received wooden housing to protect troops from the elements during longer voyages. Her single large dining salon became a troop berthing area, while a small galley designed to serve sandwiches and beverages to day trippers struggled to provide hot meals for hundreds of soldiers. The ferries presented their own unique challenges. Staten Island ferry boats, some of which dated to the 1920s, were far too slow and poorly armed for combat duty, but proved invaluable for moving troops and supplies between bases along the eastern seaboard. The ferry Knickerbocker, with her distinctive orange and green livery, painted over in military gray, spent the war shuttling between Norfolk and New York, carrying everything from fresh recruits to ammunition pallets. Hotel ships, in the truest sense of the term, also entered military service. Several large vessels that had served as floating hotels in various ports found themselves converted into barrack ships and receiving vessels for new recruits. The USS Amphitrite, originally built as a cargo vessel but converted to a receiving ship, housed thousands of sailors awaiting assignment at the Norfolk Naval Base. These stationary vessels lacked the glamour of the ongoing transports but provided essential infrastructure for a navy expanding at an unprecedented rate. The yacht conversions produced some of the war's most unusual vessels. The USS Cythera, originally built as a luxury yacht for the millionaire businessman Charles Dwight Sigsbee, measured just 150 feet in length but carried a crew of 56 and mounted 2 3-inch guns and numerous anti-aircraft weapons. Her transformation from pleasure craft to naval patrol vessel took only 6 weeks, a testament to the efficiency and desperation driving the conversion program. Captain Adolphus Andrews, commander of the Eastern Sea Frontier, faced the daunting task of defending thousands of miles of coastline with a hodgepodge fleet that included converted yachts, fishing boats, and ancient Coast Guard cutters. His reports to the Navy Department, now available in the National Archives, reveal the frustration of commanding a force that one officer described as barely sufficient to put up a fight against a determined enemy rowboat. The Patchwork fleet's coastal vessels often lacked basic equipment. Many had no radar, their radios were unreliable, and their armament consisted of outdated guns that had seen service in World War I. Despite these limitations, the smaller vessels of the Patchwork fleet scored successes. On April 14, 1942, the USS Roper, a destroyer serving with converted yachts and patrol boats, sank the German submarine U-85 off Cape Hatteras. The victory demonstrated that even improvised forces could inflict damage on the enemy, though it came after months of devastating merchant ship losses. The human stories emerging from these smaller vessels often went unrecorded, overshadowed by the dramatic battles fought by fleet units. Yet the men who served aboard converted ferries and requisitioned yachts faced dangers as real as those confronting destroyer crews. They patrolled in waters prowled by submarines, knowing their thin hulls offered no protection from torpedoes. They rescued survivors from torpedoed merchant ships, pulling oil-soaked sailors from frigid waters. They maintained their vessels with whatever spare parts could be scrounged or fabricated, keeping elderly engines running through mechanical ingenuity and sheer determination. By autumn 1942, the Patchwork fleet had evolved into a functional, if unconventional, military transportation system. The great converted liners crossed the Atlantic in massive monster convoys that sometimes included over 60 vessels, while the smaller converted ships shuttled troops and supplies to advanced bases throughout the Caribbean and along the South American coast. The USS Mount Vernon, formerly the SS Washington of the United States Lines, departed New York Harbor on September 21, 1942, carrying 7,800 troops bound for Scotland. The voyage exemplified both the capabilities and limitations of the converted vessels. Her peacetime accommodations had been designed to carry 1,899 passengers in 3 classes. With a crew of 648, now, soldiers packed every available space. They slept in hammocks, strung across former lounges, in bunks installed in drained swimming pools, and in corridor spaces barely wide enough to turn around. The crossing took 8 days, during which the troops endured conditions that would have been considered inhumane in peacetime. Toilet facilities designed for fewer than 2,000 people served nearly 8,000. Men stood in mess lines for hours, only to eat hurriedly and surrender their places to the next shift. Fresh air became a precious commodity, rationed through inadequate ventilation systems that struggled to circulate breathable air through the packed compartments. Submarine danger remained constant throughout the crossing. Although the Mount Vernon traveled too fast for most U-boats to intercept, several contacts were made with German submarines that had positioned themselves along the likely convoy routes. On September 24th, lookouts spotted a periscope 3,000 yards off the starboard beam. The ship's commander ordered emergency evasive maneuvers, and the massive liner heeled over in a turn that sent unsecured equipment crashing across compartments and knocked scores of seasick soldiers off their feet. The submarine, later identified as U-221, fired 2 torpedoes that passed astern, as the Mount Vernon's speed and maneuverability saved her from disaster. The converted liner's speed advantage came at a cost. Her elderly engines, designed for leisurely transatlantic crossings, now ran continuously at near maximum power. Breakdowns occurred with frightening regularity, and engine room crews worked under extreme pressure to maintain propulsion in submarine-infested waters. Chief Engineer Harold Whitman, who served aboard the USS Wakefield before her fire, later recalled in an oral history preserved by the Veterans History Project that we ran those engines harder than they were ever meant to run, and we did it knowing that if they quit on us in mid-ocean, we'd be sitting ducks for any U-boat that happened along. According to materials maintained by the Merchant Marine Veterans Organization, the conversion program ultimately produced over 400 military transports of various sizes. These vessels carried over 7 million troops during the war, with remarkably few losses considering the scale of operations and the constant submarine threat. The Queen Mary alone carried so many troops that if her wartime passengers were to march for abreast, the column would stretch over 200 miles. The Mediterranean theater presented additional challenges for the Patchwork fleet. The USS Ancon, former passenger cargo vessel of the Panama Railroad Company, participated in the North African landings in November 1942. Her conversion had included specialized communications equipment that made her suitable for duty as an amphibious force flagship. As American forces waded ashore at Fadala, Morocco, the Ancon coordinated landing operations from just offshore, her former cargo holds now filled with military vehicles and supplies rather than coffee and bananas. The contrast between the vessel's peacetime roles and wartime missions sometimes created surreal moments. Soldiers boarding the USS West Point in New York found faded outlines where the ship's name America had been painted on her hull. Crew members, many of whom had served aboard these vessels before the war as stewards and waiters, now wore Navy uniforms and manned battle stations instead of serving cocktails. January 1943. brought new demands, as the Pacific War's island-hopping campaign required moving massive numbers of troops across vast oceanic distances. The Patchwork fleet, already strained by Atlantic operations, now had to support simultaneous operations in two theaters separated by thousands of miles. The USS President Hayes, converted from a dollar-line passenger vessel, typified the Pacific theater transports. Built in 1924 service between San Francisco and the Orient, she had carried wealthy tourists and business travelers in considerable comfort. Her conversion retained more of her original character than the Atlantic transport's budget and time constraints meant that many Pacific conversions were less extensive than their Atlantic counterparts, resulting in vessels that blended military functionality with ghostly reminders of their peacetime elegance. The distances in the Pacific theater dwarfed Atlantic crossings. A voyage from San Francisco to Brisbane, Australia, covered over 7,000 miles and took nearly 3 weeks. During that time, troops lived in conditions that tested human endurance. Crossing the equator subjected the packed troop compartments to temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The ventilation systems, inadequate in temperate waters, became almost useless in tropical heat. Men stripped to their underwear and lay as still as possible, conserving energy while sweat poured from their bodies. Medical officers worried constantly about disease outbreaks in such crowded conditions. Any communicable illness could spread like wildfire through compartments where men slept inches apart. Dr. Raymond Hayes, who served as a medical officer aboard the USS Hunter Liggett, documented in his war diary that on one Pacific crossing, over 40% of the embarked troops suffered from seasickness, dysentery, or respiratory infections. The ship's medical facilities, designed to handle a handful of peacetime passenger ailments, struggled to cope with hundreds of sick soldiers requiring treatment simultaneously. The submarine threat in the Pacific, while different from the Atlantic wolfpacks, remained deadly. Japanese submarines adopted different tactics than their German counterparts, often focusing on warships rather than merchant vessels, but they still posed significant dangers to troop transports. The USS President Coolidge, sister ship to the President Hayes, struck mines in a friendly harbor at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides on October 26, 1942. The massive liner sank in less than 2 hours, though remarkably only 2 lives were lost from the 5,400 troops and crew aboard. The disaster demonstrated that danger could come from unexpected sources. The mines were part of an American defensive minefield, and confusion over the ship's approach had placed her in their midst. The logistical complexity of Pacific operations exceeded anything the Navy had previously attempted. Ships had to carry not only troops but also the fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment needed to sustain operations on remote islands lacking any infrastructure. The converted vessel's cargo holds, once filled with tourist luggage and mail, now carried artillery pieces, vehicles, medical supplies, and thousands of tons of ammunition. Loading and unloading these diverse cargoes at primitive anchorages taxed crews and equipment to their limits. Research published in the Journal of Military History in 2003 examined the role of converted civilian vessels in the Pacific campaign, noting that without these ships, the rapid advance across the Pacific that characterized American strategy would have been impossible. The article, authored by Professor Samuel Eliot Morrison, detailed how the Patchwork fleet provided the flexibility needed to support General Douglas MacArthur's leapfrogging strategy and Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive. The converted vessels also supported less glamorous but equally vital operations. Hospital ships, many converted from passenger liners, evacuated wounded from battle zones to rear area hospitals. The USS Comfort, converted from the Grace Line's SS Havana, served throughout the Pacific War as a hospital ship, her distinctive white hull and red crosses marking her as protected under the Geneva Convention. During the Battle of Okinawa, she treated over 7,000 casualties. Her former first-class staterooms converted into surgical suites, where doctors worked around the clock treating shattered bodies. Spring 1943 revealed the human toll of operating the Patchwork fleet under wartime conditions. The crews who operated these vessels, many of them merchant marine sailors who had known the ships in their peacetime, Glory witnessed the transformation from luxury to war machine with mixed emotions. The stewards who had once served champagne and crystal flutes now helped soldiers stow their rifles and packs. The pursers who had arranged entertainment for wealthy passengers now maintained manifests of troops heading to combat zones. Chief Steward William Thompson, who had served aboard the SS America since her maiden voyage in 1940, kept a detailed journal throughout his wartime service aboard the USS West Point. His entries, donated to the Merchant Marine Museum after his death in 1987, provide poignant insight into daily life aboard the converted liners. On March 15, 1943, he wrote, "Today we loaded 7,800 troops. They're mostly kids, 18 and 19 years old, scared and try not to show it. Remember when we carried their parents to Europe on vacation voyages? Now we're taking their children to war." The civilian crews serving aboard these vessels occupied an ambiguous position. They were not Navy personnel, though they wore uniforms and followed military discipline. They received lower pay than Navy sailors performing identical duties, and their Union protections had been suspended for the duration of the war. Yet they faced the same dangers as their uniformed counterparts. When submarines torpedoed a transport, the torpedo did not distinguish between Navy personnel and merchant marine crew. The emotional strain of wartime operations manifested in various ways. Some crew members found grim satisfaction in their work, taking pride in their contribution to the war effort. Others struggled with the transformation of vessels they had loved in peacetime into cramped, utilitarian transports. Captain Harry Manning, who commanded both the SS United States and her converted wartime incarnation, reportedly never entered the ship's former first-class lounge after its conversion, unable to bear seeing what had been done to spaces he had known in their glory. The troops passing through these vessels left their own marks. Graffiti-covered bulkheads and overheads in berthing areas, names, hometowns, messages to future passengers. Brooklyn Joe was here, bound for glory or hell. 1943 appeared scratched into a stateroom wall aboard the USS Mount Vernon. If you're reading this, "I made it through," was found written in pencil on a beam in the USS West Point's former Grand Ballroom. These messages created an unintended record of the millions who passed through these ships, each one carrying his own fears and hopes. According to documentation from the War Shipping Administration, over 243 crew members serving aboard converted civilian vessels were killed by enemy action during the war. The USS Dorchester, a converted coastal liner torpedoed on February 3, 1943, took 672 lives, including 4 Army chaplains who gave up their life jackets to soldiers and went down with the ship. Their sacrifice, immortalized in the 4 Chaplains Memorial, represented the courage displayed by countless merchant marine sailors and Navy personnel serving aboard the Patchwork fleet. The physical toll on the vessels themselves became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. The intensive operations, poor maintenance conditions, and constant strain of carrying loads far exceeding their design specifications aged the ships rapidly. The USS Wakefield, recovered from her 1942 fire, returned to service but suffered chronic mechanical problems. The USS Mount Vernon required extensive repairs after her engines nearly failed during an Atlantic crossing in March 1943. The ships were literally being worked to death in service of the war effort. Yet the pace of operations never slackened. As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe, the demand for troop transports reached unprecedented levels. Every available vessel, regardless of age or condition, was pressed into service. Ships that would have been retired in peacetime limped across oceans on patched engines, their hulls showing rust and their interiors reeking of diesel fumes and humanity. June 1944 marked the Patchwork fleet's greatest test as Operation Overlord. The invasion of Normandy required moving over 150,000 troops across the English Channel in the initial assault, with hundreds of thousands more to follow. While landing craft carried the assault waves to the beaches, the converted liners and coastal steamers brought troops and supplies to British ports and supported the massive logistical operation. The USS Wakefield, despite her earlier fire damage and mechanical problems, transported over 8,000 troops to England in early June. The ship arrived at Liverpool on June 2, 1944, just 4 days before D-Day. Her human cargo elements of the 29th Infantry Division and attached units would soon be fighting on Omaha Beach. That many would never return. The smaller vessels of the Patchwork fleet found themselves operating in unprecedented proximity to enemy forces. The USS Susan B. Anthony, a converted Grace Line passenger ship, struck a mine off Utah Beach on June 7 while positioned to support the invasion. The crew managed to evacuate all 2,400 troops and crew before the ship sank. But the loss removed a critical transport from service at a crucial moment. Channel crossings brought the converted vessels closer to enemy action than most had experienced. Since entering service, German aircraft attacked convoys in the Channel, and fast E-boats motor torpedo boats prowled the waters, looking for targets. The converted liners' anti-aircraft armament, installed during their conversions, saw action for the first time as German planes attempted to disrupt the massive flow of troops and supplies to France. Quartermaster Paul Davidson, serving aboard the USS Mount Vernon during this period, later recounted in an oral history that the Channel crossings felt more dangerous than the Atlantic runs, despite being much shorter. In the Atlantic, you had the U-boats to worry about, but there was a lot of ocean, and you were moving fast, he explained. In the Channel, you had U-boats, mines, aircraft, and you were in restricted waters with hundreds of other vessels. It felt like the whole world was trying to sink you. The support vessels, converted ferries, and coastal steamers worked around the clock, shuttling supplies between Britain and France once the beachheads were secured. The old Staten Island ferryboat Knickerbocker, now painted gray and armed with machine guns, made over 300 Channel crossings between June 1945. Her crew, many of whom had operated her on her peacetime route, knew every quirk of her engines and coaxed performance from the elderly vessel that her designers would have thought impossible. As Allied forces pushed inland, the emphasis shifted from troop transport to logistical support. The converted vessels brought ammunition, fuel, rations, and replacement equipment to French ports. They evacuated wounded back to Britain for treatment. They transported German prisoners of war to detention camps. The versatility that had made them valuable at the war's beginning now proved essential in supporting the final push to victory. According to records maintained by the Naval Historical Center, the Patchwork fleet transported over 2.3 million troops to Europe in preparation for and during the invasion of France. The scale of this operation exceeded anything previously attempted in military history. At the operation's peak, a troop ship departed an American port bound for Europe every 6 hours. An unbroken stream of vessels crossing the submarine, infested Atlantic, carrying the men and material needed to sustain the campaign. The human drama playing out aboard these vessels intensified as victory approached. Soldiers making the crossing after D-Day knew with greater certainty what awaited them combat in the hedgerows of Normandy or the frozen forests of Belgium. The earlier innocence, when many troops crossed the Atlantic viewing it as an adventure, had disappeared. Now the troops were grimmer, more focused, understanding the reality of the war they were joining. January 1945 found the Patchwork fleet more exhausted than ever, but facing new demands. With Germany collapsing and Japan fighting desperately to defend its home islands, the strategic situation required a massive redeployment of troops from Europe to the Pacific. The converted vessels, many showing their age and the wear of years of intensive operations, faced the daunting task of moving hundreds of thousands of troops halfway around the world. The USS West Point, which had crossed the Atlantic repeatedly since 1942, underwent hasty repairs in New York before departing for the Panama Canal and the Pacific. Her engines, which had already exceeded their design life by thousands of hours, showed increasing signs of wear. Her hull, subjected to 4 years of pounding by Atlantic storms, leaked in several places despite repeated repairs. Yet she remained in service because the Navy had no replacement for her capacity. The war's final months brought bittersweet moments for the Patchwork fleet. Victory in Europe on May 8, 1945, transformed these vessels from instruments of war to instruments of peace, at least in the Atlantic. Almost immediately, they began bringing American troops home from Europe. The Magic Carpet operation, as it became known, would ultimately repatriate millions of servicemen, and the converted liners formed the backbone of this effort. The homeward crossings carried a different atmosphere than the westward voyages. The troops, now veterans of the European campaign, crowded the decks as they approached New York Harbor, straining for their first glimpse of the Statue of Liberty. The same compartments that had carried frightened recruits to war now brought home hardened survivors, Chief Steward Thompson noted. In his journal on June 23, 1945, "They're different men than the ones we took over. Harder, quieter, older, somehow even if they're still kids. And there are fewer of them. We took 8,000 to Europe on our first trip. We've brought back maybe 6,000 total on 3 return trips. The Pacific continued to demand vessels even as the Atlantic operations wound down. The USS President Hayes, which had been shuttling troops across the Pacific since 1943, prepared for what everyone expected would be the invasion of Japan itself. Her crew understood that such an operation would dwarf even today in scale and likely cost. The conversion of European theater vessels to Pacific service accelerated through the summer of 1945 as the Navy positioned assets for the final assault. Then, on August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The war was over. The relief that swept through the Patchwork fleet was palpable. Ships that had been preparing for the invasion of Japan suddenly found their missions transformed. Instead of carrying troops to assault beaches, they would bring them home. The USS Mount Vernon, positioned in the Pacific for the invasion, reversed course and began repatriating troops from various Pacific islands to the United States. The scale of the repatriation effort exceeded even the wartime deployment. Over 8 million service members needed to return home from theaters around the world, and they all wanted to come home immediately. The Patchwork fleet operated at maximum capacity, with ships making turnaround times that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. Crews worked around the clock loading, crossing, unloading, and preparing for the next trip, according to research published in the American Neptune Journal in 2009. The converted civilian vessels of the Patchwork fleet transported over 4 million troops home in the year following Japan's surrender. The article noted that this reverse operation proved in some ways more challenging than the wartime deployments, as everyone wanted passage immediately, and tempers frayed among troops forced to wait for available transport space. The last operational voyage of a Patchwork fleet vessel in military service occurred on December 20th, 1946, when the USS West Point completed her final troop transport mission, arriving in New York with 847 returning servicemen. By then, most of the converted vessels had already been returned to civilian control and were undergoing reconversion to peacetime configuration or heading to scrapyards. The process of returning the Patchwork fleet to civilian service proved nearly as complex as their original conversion. The vessels that had served so effectively in wartime were worn, battered, and in many cases barely seaworthy. The question facing ship owners and the government was whether these ships could or should return to commercial service. Some vessels never made it back. The USS Wakefield, which had survived her 1942 fire and years of hard service, was decommissioned and sold for scrap in 1947. Her engines were beyond economical repair, and the extensive fire damage had weakened her structure. She was broken up in Baltimore, her steel recycled into other products. The USS Susan B. Anthony rested on the bottom of the English Channel, a permanent casualty of war. The great liners faced the most difficult decisions. The SS America, which had served as USS West Point, returned to United States Lines Control in 1946. Her owners faced enormous reconstruction costs to restore her to passenger service. The ship that had once represented the pinnacle of American maritime elegance had been stripped bare, her engines worn out, her hull showing the scars of 4 years of military service. United States Lines invested over $10 million, an enormous sum, in 1946 to restore her. She returned to commercial transatlantic service in November 1946, once again carrying passengers rather than troops. Other vessels received similar treatment. The SS Manhattan and SS Washington returned to service after extensive reconversions. Their operators discovered, however, that the maritime world had changed during the war years. Air travel was developing rapidly, and the ocean liner business would never recover its pre-war profitability. The ships that had carried millions to war found themselves increasingly obsolete in the post-war world. The smaller vessels of the Patchwork fleet faced varied fates. Many coastal steamers and ferries returned to their pre-war routes, their military service becoming part of their lore, but not preventing them from resuming civilian duties. The Staten Island ferryboat Knickerbocker returned to her peacetime run, her orange and green livery restored, though her crew never forgot the channel crossings and the sound of German aircraft overhead. She served until 1954, when age finally forced her retirement earned through both civilian and military service. The yachts and fishing vessels pressed into coastal patrol duty returned to private ownership when their owners could be located. Gade. Many, however, had been owned by individuals who had died during the war or who no longer had the means to maintain such vessels. These craft were sold at government surplus auctions, often for a fraction of their pre-war value. The USS Cythera, which had hunted submarines off the Carolina coast, ended her days as a fishing boat operating out of Gloucester, Massachusetts. Her military armament removed, but her wartime service remembered by her crew. The human legacy of the Patchwork fleet proved more enduring than the vessels themselves. The millions of service members who crossed oceans aboard these ships never forgot the experience. Veterans organizations formed around specific vessels, the West Point Association, Mount Vernon Society, brought together men who had served aboard or been transported by these ships. Their reunions, held annually for decades after the war, kept alive the memories of those crowded crossings, the fear of submarine attack, the relief of safe arrival. Chief Steward William Thompson, whose journal documented life aboard the USS West Point, continued sailing in the merchant marine until his retirement in 1968. In a final journal entry dated December 31st, 1968, he reflected on his wartime service. "I've spent 40 years at sea, but nothing compared to those war years. We took farm boys who'd never seen the ocean and carried them to foreign wars. Some came back, some didn't. The ship survived, though she was never the same. Neither was Iuka and carry 8,000 men to war and bring back 6,000 without it changing you. The statistical record of the Patchwork fleet speaks to its significance." According to the final accounting by the War Shipping Administration, released in 1947, converted civilian vessels transported over 7.2 million troops during the war years, carried over 300 million tons of cargo, and steamed over 120 million miles in military service. Wow. They did this while suffering remarkably few losses. Only 37 converted passenger vessels were sunk by enemy action, taking approximately 11,000 lives, far fewer casualties than pessimistic pre-war projections had suggested. The broader impact of the Patchwork fleet on American military logistics cannot be overstated. The United States fought a global war on multiple continents simultaneously, an achievement impossible without the massive transportation capacity these converted vessels provided. The great liners, the coastal steamers, the converted yachts and ferries all played essential roles in maintaining the flow of troops and supplies that sustained American forces throughout the world. Maritime historians have debated whether the Patchwork fleet represented effective planning or fortunate improvisation. The truth lies somewhere between. The pre-war United States possessed neither the naval construction capacity nor the time to build purpose-designed military transports in sufficient numbers to meet wartime demands. The decision to convert civilian vessels was born of necessity, but it was executed with remarkable efficiency and ultimately proved highly effective. The converted vessels' speed, capacity, versatility exceeded what newly constructed transports could have provided, even if purpose-built ships might have been more comfortable or efficient. The experience of converting civilian vessels to military service during World War II influenced post-war military planning. The Military Sea Transportation Service, established in 1949, maintained reserve fleets of merchant vessels that could be quickly converted to military use in the event of future conflicts. During the Korean War, Vietnam War, and subsequent conflicts, this reserve fleet provided transportation capacity, though never again on the scale of World War II's Patchwork fleet. By 2025, few physical remnants of the Patchwork fleet remained. The SS United States, launched in 1952 as a purpose-designed troop transport capable of rapid conversion from civilian to military service, a direct legacy of World War II experience, at a Philadelphia pier, her future uncertain. She represented the last echo of an era when ships, not aircraft, carried America's armies to war. The memory of the Patchwork fleet lives on in maritime museums, veterans' oral histories, and the scholarship of military historians. Models of the USS West Point and USS Mount Vernon occupy places of honor at the United States Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, New York. Photographs of troops crowding the decks of converted liners as they approached New York Harbor hang in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. These images capture a unique moment in American history when luxury became sacrifice, when vessels built for pleasure served the grim purposes of war. The story of the Patchwork Fleet ultimately represents a triumph of American adaptability and industrial capacity. Faced with an unprecedented logistical challenge, transporting millions of troops across hostile oceans, while simultaneously protecting vital supply lines, the United States improvised a solution using the resources at hand. That solution, born of necessity and executed under intense pressure, proved remarkably effective. The hotels that went to war served their purpose and brought most of their passengers home safely. An achievement that should not be forgotten as the last veterans of that era pass from living memory. The legacy extends beyond military history into the broader story of American maritime enterprise. The ships of the Patchwork Fleet represented the apex of pre-war American passenger vessel design and construction. Their sacrifice for many were literally worked to destruction, and wartime service contributed to the victory but also marked the end of an era. The post-war world belonged to airlines, not ocean liners. And the age of grand passenger ships ended in the war years when those ships proved their worth in military rather than civilian service. Today, when millions of Americans travel by air without a thought for the logistics that make such travel possible, it is worth remembering. A time when crossing an ocean meant days or weeks aboard crowded vessels, when enemy submarines prowled the depths, when reaching one's destination safely was never guaranteed. The men and women who built, operated, and traveled aboard the Patchwork Fleet demonstrated the same courage and determination that characterized America's entire war effort. Their story deserves to be remembered and honored as an essential chapter in the history of World War II and American maritime heritage. The transformation of luxury liners into troop transports, of coastal ferries into patrol vessels, of private yachts into submarine hunters, these conversions symbolize the larger transformation of American society during the war years. Just as the ships set aside their peacetime elegance and purpose to serve military necessity, so too did the nation as a whole subordinate civilian comfort and preference to the demands of total war. And just as most of the ships survived to return to civilian service after the war, so too did the nation emerge from the conflict ready to resume peacetime pursuits, forever changed by the experience but fundamentally intact. The Patchwork Fleet sailed into history. Its vessels scattered to scrapyards and museum berths, its crews dispersed into civilian life. Its passengers returned to farms and factories and offices across America, but the memory of those gray-painted ships, crowded with young men heading to war, remains a powerful reminder of sacrifice, service, and the terrible logistics of global conflict. In the end, the hotels that went to war fulfilled their mission, carrying a generation to battle and bringing survivors home. Their contribution to victory, as vital as any army division or naval squadron,